You know the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, right? But what you've never heard about this epic legend is what really happened behind the scenes of the Labyrinth of Crete. How a young, fearless hero, full of courage, faced one of the most feared creatures in mythology and at the same time shaped the destiny of an entire civilization. In this video, we'll reveal the secrets behind this incredible journey, the unexpected choices Theseus had to make, and how his actions not only defeated a monster, but also forever changed the future of Athens. Get ready to uncover the true story of the Minotaur and what you've never been told about the hero who challenged the impossible. Are you ready to enter the labyrinth and learn about the legacy of Theseus? Then stay with us until the end. And let's begin this journey now. King Aegeus paced back and forth in his palace, his brow furrowed and his heart heavy. What good was it to rule Athens if he had no heir to continue his legacy? Year after year he tried, but the gods seemed to ignore his pleas. Without a son, his throne might fall into the wrong hands, and his name would be forgotten in the dust of time. Not knowing what else to do, Aegeus decided to seek answers. He left Athens and traveled to the kingdom of Troezen, where the wise King Theseus lived. It was said that he understood the signs of the gods and knew secrets that few men dared question. Perhaps there he would find the solution to his torment. Theseus welcomed Aegeus with a smile and an attentive ear, but behind his friendly expression, something else was lurking. He saw an opportunity. If his family were linked to the throne of Athens, his power would expand. So instead of just advising Aegeus, he decided to act. That night, servants brought wine in abundance, stronger than any drink King Aegeus had ever tasted. Theseus encouraged him to drink to forget his worries. When the king was already dizzy and unclear in his thoughts, Theseus called his daughter Aethra and whispered something in her ear. Hours later, as the sun began to rise on the horizon, Aegeus awoke in an unfamiliar bed. His head was throbbing, and it took him a few seconds to realize where he was. Then his eyes found the young woman lying beside him. Aethra was sleeping peacefully as he tried to piece together the events of the previous night. The wine, the conversations, the fog in his mind. What exactly had happened? The answer would come in time, but one thing was certain. Destiny was already in motion. The first piece of the puzzle had been placed, and from that moment on, nothing could be undone. Days passed, and Aegeus, still confused about the night in Troezen, decided to return to Athens. But before he left, he called Aethra for a serious conversation. If the gods will it, and a child is born from this night, tell him that one day he will have a great destiny, he said, his gaze filled with mystery. Then he led the young woman to a large stone on the outskirts of Theseus's palace. With effort, he lifted the rock and revealed what was hidden underneath, a gleaming sword and a pair of sandals. If it's a boy, when he is strong enough to lift this stone, tell him to come find me in Athens. When he is able to take this sword in his own hands, he will be ready to learn his origin. Without explaining any further, Aegeus left, leaving Aethra with a promise and a secret. Time passed, and Aethra gave birth to a boy with bright eyes and a restless spirit. His name would be Theseus. From a young age, he showed an energy that seemed bigger than himself. While other children played aimlessly, he already sought challenges, always wanting to prove his strength. His grandfather, Theseus, watched him grow and smiled to himself. He knew that this boy was no ordinary one. Theseus had the blood of a king and a destiny written by the gods. Then came the day. The boy, now strong and fearless, learned of the stone and the challenge awaiting him. His muscles tensed, his hands gripped the edges of the rock, and with an effort that made his whole body tremble, he lifted it. The weight was immense, but His will was greater, and there it was, his father's sword, shining under the sun, waiting for his hands. Aethra watched him with a mix of pride and emotion. The moment she had both feared and awaited had arrived. "It's time, my son," she said. "Your destiny awaits you in Athens." Theseus took the sword firmly. His heart raced. He didn't know what he would find in the great city. But one thing was certain: he wouldn't turn back. His path to glory had begun. As Theseus prepared for his journey to Athens, something sinister was already unfolding within his father's palace. At that time, a new figure had gained a place by King Aegeus's side, the powerful sorceress Medea. She was no ordinary woman. Known for her cunning and magical abilities, Medea had fled Corinth after a series of tragedies and found refuge in Athens. Aegeus, enchanted by her intelligence and promises of power, welcomed her into his kingdom, unaware that he was bringing a serpent into his home. Over time, Medea not only became the king's advisor, but also his companion. And it was then that she made her most tempting promise: "I will give you a son, my king, a legitimate heir, someone who will ensure your lineage without threats." Aegeus, desperate to secure his descent, accepted without questioning. What he didn't know was that Medea saw her position in Athens as something to be protected at any cost. If she had a child with the king, she would ensure that no one could ever challenge the throne. And it was at that moment that her fate and Theseus's began to intersect. While the young man traveled through dusty roads and faced dangers on his journey, Medea strengthened her influence over Aegeus, spreading her threads of control over the king and his kingdom. She had already foreseen the future, and in it there was no room for another heir. The danger for Theseus was already lurking long before he even reached Athens. Months passed, and Medea's promise was fulfilled. She gave birth to a boy whom she named Medus. Aegeus was ecstatic. Now he finally had a legitimate heir to rule Athens after him. Medea, however, was not a woman who trusted in chance. Since the birth of the little prince, she had been working quietly to ensure no one would ever threaten her son's throne. Meanwhile, in Troezen, Theseus continued to grow. Though he still didn't know his true identity, his destiny was already sealed. He trained every day, strengthening his body and mind, as if instinctively preparing for the challenges to come. His grandfather, Pythias, saw in him a different kind of spark, a vigor that reminded him of the great heroes. But the time for waiting came to an end. On the day Theseus lifted the stone and wielded his father's sword, Aethra knew she could no longer hide the truth. With a voice filled with emotion, she told him about Aegeus, his royal lineage, and the city that awaited him. "Your father is in Athens," she said, "but there's something you need to know. The throne is not empty. There are those who have plans for it, and for you." Theseus, however, was unshaken. If his journey was uncertain, then he would face it with courage. His blood was that of kings and warriors, and he wouldn't shy away from what destiny had in store for him. And so, with the sword in hand and a determined heart, Theseus set off for Athens, unaware that upon his arrival he would find a web of intrigue already prepared for his destruction. Medea's game was just beginning. The journey to Athens was long and dangerous. Many would have chosen the sea route, avoiding the risks of the road, but not Theseus. He decided to travel by land because he wanted to prove his worth by facing any challenge that came his way. And challenges were plentiful. The roads between Troezen and Athens were infested with bandits and cruel creatures, men who terrorized travelers without mercy. But for Theseus, each encounter was an opportunity to show his strength. The first of them was Periphetes, the Cyclops with the bronze club. This monstrous giant ambushed travelers and crushed them with his huge club. Theseus, however, didn't retreat. With agility, he dodged the brutal blows, and when he saw an opening, struck. With his newly discovered strength, he knocked Periphetes down and took his weapon as a trophy. He continued his journey, facing other legendary villains. Sinis, the tree destroyer, who bent pine trees and tore his victims apart by releasing them. Skyron, the bandit who pushed travelers off a cliff to be devoured by a giant turtle. And Procrustes, the sadistic innkeeper, who stretched or cut his guests to make them fit his iron bed. Theseus defeated all, not only with strength but also with intelligence. With each enemy he conquered, his fame grew. The rumors of a young warrior clearing the roads of criminals reached Athens even before his arrival. But it wasn't just strength that shaped Theseus's spirit. During one of his stops, he had an unexpected encounter with a man who would change his view of the world, Hercules. The demigod was resting after yet another of his feats when he saw young Theseus approach. Even though he was still a teenager, the boy showed no fear or hesitation in front of the living legend. On the contrary, he looked him in the eyes with respect and determination. Hercules smiled. He saw in Theseus a reflection of himself, a warrior destined for great deeds. As a token of recognition, he ripped out one of the teeth of the Nemean lion, the invincible beast he had defeated, and gave it to the young man. "A hero needs courage," Hercules said, "but also wisdom. Let this tooth remind you that strength without control is just destruction." Theseus held the tooth between his fingers and nodded. He already knew that his journey would not be just about battles, but also about choices. Now Athens was closer than ever, and his true challenge was about to begin. With his ancestral sword strapped to his waist and the bronze club of Periphetes resting on his shoulder, Theseus finally saw Athens on the horizon. The city gleamed under the sun, its imposing walls and majestic temples standing out on the hilltops. The young warrior's heart raced. This was his true home, the place where he would find his father and claim his birthright. But Athens was not just a grand city. It was also a boiling cauldron of intrigue, and inside the royal palace, someone was already waiting for his arrival with bad intentions. Medea, the cunning sorceress, had learned of Theseus's deeds even before he crossed the city gates. Her mind worked quickly, a young outsider of unknown blood, gaining fame as a hero and heading straight for the king. That could only mean one thing: a threat to the future of her son, Medos. Meanwhile, Theseus advanced through the streets of Athens, feeling the curious stares of the citizens. Many whispered among themselves, recognizing the young warrior whose feats had already become legends. But there were also suspicious glances. Athens was going through uncertain times, and strangers who stood out too much were rarely welcomed. When he finally reached the palace, he was greeted by the guards. Without hesitation, he raised his voice. "I am Theseus, son of Aegeus, and I come to meet my father." The news spread through the palace like thunder. Aegeus, already an aged and tired man, heard the name and felt a strange unease. Could it be true? Could this young man really be the son he had never known? But before he could react, Medea was already by his side, whispering in his ear, "My king, be careful. Many have tried to deceive you in the past. This young man may be an impostor, a spy, an enemy in disguise. Let me take care of this." Aegeus, uncertain and influenced by years of manipulation by Medea, nodded. The sorceress then hatched her plan. Theseus could not leave the palace alive. The young hero hardly knew that his greatest battle was yet to begin, and that the most dangerous enemy was not a monster or a bandit, but a woman with a sharp and unscrupulous mind. Theseus was received in the palace with some coldness. Though he was before his father, Aegeus did not show the excitement the young man had expected. The king seemed cautious, distrustful, as if trying to see through him, and at his right was Medea, the true influence behind his decisions. The sorceress observed the young man with sharp eyes. He was strong, determined, and above all, He reminded Aegeus of his younger self. This worried her. If that boy truly were the king's son, both her position and that of her son Medos would be in danger. Medea needed to act quickly. "Majesty," she said, her voice soft as poison dripping from a golden chalice, "this young man may be an impostor, someone seeking to usurp your throne. But there is a way to discover his loyalty." Aegeus raised an eyebrow. Medea continued, "A truly noble warrior would not refuse a banquet offered by his king. Let me prepare a special wine to celebrate his arrival." The king nodded, unaware of the trap being set around him. That same night a great banquet was served. Theseus sat before his father, excited but unaware that each cup of wine passing through his hands was laced with poison, a deadly brew that Medea had personally concocted. The sorceress watched with a discreet smile as Theseus's cup was filled. It would only take one sip, and the problem would be solved. But fate has always had other plans. The moment Theseus brought the cup to his lips, Aegeus noticed something. The light of the torches illuminated the young man's sword, resting at his waist. The sword he himself had left beneath the stone so many years ago. His heart raced. He recognized that weapon. Only one person could possess it. "Stop!" the king shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. Everyone froze. Theseus lowered the cup, surprised. Medea, for a moment, lost her serene mask and let slip a look of hatred. Aegeus stood up, approaching the young man with wide eyes. His trembling hand touched the sword, and his voice came out hoarse. "This weapon, where did you get it?" Theseus, not understanding the commotion, answered sincerely, "My father left it for me under a great stone in Trezena. He said that when I was strong enough to lift it, I should come to Athens." The hall fell silent. Aegeus felt the weight of every word. "My son," he murmured, then embraced him, holding him as if he had found a lost piece of his soul. Medea knew it was over. Her plan had failed, and now there was no place for her on the throne of Athens. But the sorceress didn't wait to see the outcome. Before they could capture her, she fled the palace with Medos, disappearing into the darkness of the night. Theseus was safe. And more than that, he had finally been recognized by his father, but his destiny still held many challenges. The palace hall was still in shock. The poison that almost took Theseus' life remained untouched in the cup, and the revelation of his identity echoed like thunder among those present. King Aegeus, overcome with emotion, held his son's shoulders, examining every detail of his face, as if trying to make up for the years of absence. But the joy of the reunion was quickly replaced by rage. Medea, the woman he had taken in and trusted, had tried to kill his own heir. "Guards!" Aegeus shouted, his voice reverberating through the stone walls. "Arrest this witch!" All eyes turned to Medea, but she had already anticipated this moment. With a swift movement, she pulled Medos close and muttered words in a forgotten tongue. The flames of the torches flickered, and a gust of wind swept through the hall, blowing the guests' robes and scattering the banquet tablecloths across the floor. The soldiers hesitated for a moment, confused by the sudden windstorm. And it was enough time. Medea grabbed Medos and ran for the palace balcony. The night outside was dark, but the sea reflected a silvery glow under the moonlight. She had no allies there, no time to fight. Her only option was to flee. "You won't defeat me so easily," she shouted, her voice full of hatred and contempt. Aegeus advanced toward her, but Medea was already raising her arms to the sky, invoking her magic one last time. From the shadows, a chariot pulled by winged serpents appeared, descending from the heavens like an omen of her curse. Those present recoiled at the terrifying sight. Theseus, still trying to grasp the magnitude of the events, ran to stop her, but it was too late. Medea pulled Medos into the chariot, and in the blink of an eye, the serpent horses flapped their wings and lifted them into the sky, disappearing into the starry night. Silence fell over Athens. The guards were paralyzed. Aegeus, though furious, felt an unexpected relief. Medea was gone, and his son was finally by his side. But Theseus didn't only feel relief. Something inside him told him that this would not be the last time they would hear the name of Medea. While Athens celebrated the discovery of its rightful heir on a distant island, another story was unfolding. A story of broken promises and the wrath of the gods. In the heart of the palace of Knossos on Crete, King Minos walked solemnly toward the altar dedicated to Poseidon. The great god of the seas was the patron of his dynasty, the one who sustained his power and authority. Minos knew this better than anyone. "O powerful Poseidon," began the king, raising his hands to the sky, his voice echoing through the marble corridors. "Prove to the world that my right to the throne comes from the gods. Send me a sign, and in your honor I will sacrifice everything you offer me." Minos' request was not a mere wish. His reign, though strong, was not unquestionable. His brothers, Rhadamanthus and Sarpedon, contested his authority, and the nobles of Crete still whispered that he was not the chosen one of the gods. He needed irrefutable proof, something that would show that his lineage was sacred. Poseidon listened. From the crystal-clear waters of the Aegean Sea, a creature of supernatural beauty emerged. A bull as white as the foam of the waves, with bright eyes and a majestic bearing, rose from the depths and walked along the sand as if the gods themselves were carrying it. The Cretans gathered on the beach, amazed. King Minos himself was speechless. Before that sight, the bull was more than a divine gift. It was a symbol of power, an animal worthy of worship. The priests took it to the temple, preparing it for sacrifice. But as Minos watched the creature, a doubt began to grow within him. Should he really kill it? The promise had been clear. Poseidon had sent a sign, and the king was supposed to fulfill his part of the agreement. But that bull, it was perfect. Shouldn't a gift from the gods be preserved? What if he tricked Poseidon and sacrificed another bull in its place? Minos hesitated. He looked at the priests, the nobles, the animal before him. Then he made his decision. The next day, another bull, less impressive, was brought to the altar. The blood was spilled, the prayers were sung, and Minos tried to convince everyone, and himself, that the pact had been fulfilled. But the gods are not fools. From the depths of the ocean, Poseidon watched. He knew of the betrayal. He knew the white bull still lived, grazing in the fields of Crete, far from the altar that should have received it. And if Minos thought he could deceive a god, he would soon learn that divine wrath knows no bounds. The sun set over Crete, tinting the sea with gold and pink, but a shadow was forming over the kingdom. The white bull, that magnificent gift from Poseidon, still grazed peacefully in the palace fields, and Minos felt a strange unease in his chest. Despite the grand feast, the pomp, and the apparent success of his maneuver, a feeling of wrongdoing consumed him. When night fell, Minos went to the stables to look at the bull again. He found it calm, its coat shimmering under the moonlight. The king could no longer ignore his betrayal. He had kept the bull alive, hidden from everyone. But Poseidon knew. The god of the seas always knew. That same night on Mount Olympus, Poseidon was gathered with the other gods. His anger was palpable. It wasn't just the breaking of a promise, but an insult to his authority. Minos, the king he had chosen, had dared to deceive him, and for that he would awaken fury that should never have been provoked. "Minos has defied the power of the gods. He will be punished," said Poseidon, his voice rumbling like thunder. With a subtle wave of his hand, the sea began to stir. A massive wave formed on the horizon, a clear sign that revenge was about to be unleashed. Poseidon would not settle for a mere reprimand. He wanted Minos to know, in a brutal way, that the gods should never be challenged with impunity. Meanwhile, in the palace of Knossos, Minos did not feel the storm forming. He was immersed in his own thoughts, trying to find a way to deal with the growing pressure to fulfill his promises. But fate had other plans. The next day, a great fair was organized. In Crete, an event to celebrate the power of the kingdom and the approaching harvest. People from all over the empire gathered to see the animals and festivities. Minos, confident that his secret was safe, kept the bull even more hidden, ensuring that no one knew of his betrayal. But he didn't know that his kingdom was about to be shaken in a way he could never imagine. That same morning, a lightning bolt illuminated the skies, and the waters of the sea began to stir with an intensity never before seen. It was Poseidon who would no longer tolerate the affront. Within hours, the beaches of Crete were invaded by monstrous waves, and the very white bull, enraged, began attacking the coastal villages. Minos tried to control the situation, but the uncontrollable winds and waters seemed like a natural force against which he had no power. The giant waves swallowed boats, and the bull's fury made all who came near tremble with fear. Minos's subjects began to scream, running in panic through the streets of Knossos. The king, now desperate, watched his kingdom be destroyed before his eyes. He knew that his betrayal had caused Poseidon's wrath and that the consequences would be terrible. The land of Crete trembled under the weight of divine vengeance. And Minos, unable to repair his mistake, felt the weight of his arrogance fall upon his shoulders. Poseidon, furious and relentless, had not finished. Minos's kingdom was now at the mercy of the whims of the sea and its angry god. With Poseidon's fury still devastating Crete, King Minos tried in vain to restore order in his kingdom. The waves continued to swallow the coast, and the white bull, a wild creature now dominated by divine rage, destroyed everything in its path. But in Minos's heart, there was another growing fear, something he could not control. In his palace, he sought solace in his own thoughts, questioning his failure before the gods. But Poseidon would not be the only god to make his presence known. The image of the white bull still haunted his mind, and the consequences of his betrayal seemed only just beginning. Poseidon, however, was not content with mere destruction. He wanted more. He wanted to show Minos that the pain of his betrayal would be deep and eternal. It was then that, on Olympus, the little god Eros, god of love and passion, was summoned to Poseidon's presence. Eros, who had the power to enchant hearts and turn the noblest thoughts into uncontrollable desires, received an order that caused him to smile mischievously. Poseidon, with his pitiless gaze, asked Eros to sow an impossible love, a forbidden passion that would shake the very foundations of Minos's kingdom. "Eros," said the god of the seas, his voice making the very wind stop to listen. "Make Pasiphae, the queen of Crete, fall in love with the white bull. Let her feel in her heart an uncontrollable desire, so that Minos's kingdom will feel the pain of his failure even more." Eros, amused by the request, raised his small quiver, full of arrows that could turn any being into a captive of impossible love. And with a simple motion, he shot a golden arrow toward Queen Pasiphae. The power of Eros's arrow was such that no one could resist its effect, and the queen, with her pure and noble heart, suddenly found herself consumed by an unusual passion, completely out of her control. Pasiphae, a woman of great wisdom and dignity, began to see the white bull not just as an animal, but as a mesmerizing vision. In her mind, he became more than a mere beast. She saw his strength, his majesty, and a wild beauty that she could not resist. The desire consumed her at every moment, a forbidden flame that made her feel something she had never imagined. Desperate to satisfy this impulse, Pasiphae sought out the only man who could help her, Daedalus, the ingenious craftsman who served at Minos's court. She sought him out, without revealing the true reason for her request. But Daedalus, always astute, soon realized what was happening. "Queen, what do you desire?" he asked, though he already knew that his help would somehow be involved in something dark. "I need a way to get close to the bull, something that will allow me to be near him," she said, her voice trembling with desire. Daedalus, seeing the queen's internal struggle and knowing that this would be an impossible task, proposed an unusual solution. He would build a hollow wooden cow. Pasiphae, by entering the structure, could approach the bull without raising suspicion. An idea he knew could lead to unpredictable consequences, but one he could not refuse. Meanwhile, Poseidon, deep beneath the sea, watched everything with a sadistic smile, knowing that Eros's spell had worked. Pasiphae was now trapped in an impossible love, and the kingdom of Minos, shaken by the betrayal of its king, would soon witness the consequences of this forbidden passion unfold. With the request made, Daedalus had no choice but to accept the task, though he knew the dangerous implications of this situation. The brilliant man, known for his unique ability to create intricate gadgets and complex inventions, plunged headfirst into his project. He knew that the fate of Crete could be irreversibly altered by his creation, but the Queen Pasiphae's desire was something he could not ignore, especially knowing that refusing her could bring dire consequences. Daedalus spent days in his workshop, surrounded by rare woods, ropes, and tools that shaped unknown forms. He worked tirelessly, taking every precaution to ensure that the wooden cow was realistic enough to deceive the bull, but also comfortable for Pasiphae, who would be inside. During this time, the atmosphere in Crete grew increasingly tense. Signs of destruction caused by Poseidon's wrath showed no sign of stopping, and the city seemed in a constant state of panic. People began to murmur about the divine forces being unleashed upon the kingdom, but Minos was more concerned with losing control over his wife and the kingdom itself. He felt he could no longer escape the web he had woven by defying the gods. Finally, Daedalus completed his work. He presented the queen with a beautifully crafted wooden cow with an opening on the side where Pasiphae could enter. It was a masterpiece of engineering, like everything Daedalus created, but now it was also the instrument that would allow the queen to fulfill her forbidden desire. The structure was designed to look as realistic as possible, with silk hairs that mimicked the texture of the bull and ivory horns. Pasiphae, her eyes burning with desire, wasted no time. She entered the wooden cow, and as she hid inside, she felt a mix of shame and excitement. She knew that what was about to happen would dishonor her, but she could not resist the overwhelming force of the passion consuming her. The white bull, attracted by the presence of the cow, approached and without hesitation mounted her, unaware of the true nature of the creature within. The union was quick and intense, and Pasiphae, caught up in the moment, did not realize what had happened until after some time the bull pulled away and a sense of emptiness filled her. But deep down, she knew something bigger was about to happen. The wild passion that had consumed her had unforeseen results. When she emerged from the cow, what Pasiphae discovered was something she hadn't imagined. She was pregnant, and it wasn't just any pregnancy. The child she carried wasn't a normal son, but something much more monstrous, a creature of immense power. The white bull had left its mark on her in a way no one could have predicted. Daedalus, upon learning of the gravity of the situation, was horrified. He knew something monstrous was about to be born, but as always, he also knew he could not escape his responsibility for his creation. The Minotaur was coming, and Crete would never be the same. Time passed quickly, and Pasiphae, now a shadow of herself, carried in her womb the promise of something that, when born, would change the fate of all in Crete. The queen, still haunted by the experience, felt the weight of guilt, but also a strange connection to what was forming inside her. She knew she could not deny the truth. She was about to give birth to a monstrous creature, When the child was finally born, what came into the world was not human. The Minotaur, a being with a human body but the head of a bull, seemed to have been created by a force beyond mortal comprehension. His eyes, wild and relentless, reflected the fury of the gods who had contributed to his conception. The creature's cry, deep and hoarse, echoed through the palace halls like a harbinger of terror. Minos, upon being informed of the birth, rushed to the queen's chamber, but when he saw the monstrosity before him, a chill ran down his spine. He looked at Pasiphae, a mixture of horror and rage on his face. How could it be possible that he, a king, was facing something so incomprehensible, the result of his own failure before the gods? The Minotaur, with its robust muscles and threatening appearance, was no longer a mere child. It was a beast, a true aberration. The king, terrified by the idea of having such a destructive creature in his kingdom, ordered that the beast be confined. However, Daedalus's creation was not something easily controlled. Minos knew the Minotaur, with its immense strength and uncontrollable rage, posed a constant threat. It was then that the king, in a desperate move, ordered Daedalus to build something that could contain the beast. He summoned the great engineer for another task, unaware that this decision would forever change the fate of Crete. Daedalus, though fearful of the consequences of his invention, accepted, knowing that his genius might be the only way to prevent disaster. Daedalus, using all his talent and ingenuity, constructed an underground labyrinth, complex and intricate, designed to keep the Minotaur trapped. The labyrinth, which stretched for many kilometers below the earth, was built with winding passages, walls that seemed to move, and traps that would confuse anyone trying to enter. He knew it would be impossible to escape such a structure without a map, but even so, he was aware that this might be the last act of his life. He had created the Minotaur, and now he was creating its prison. The Minotaur was taken to the labyrinth, where it would spend its days wandering aimlessly, but always hungry, always seeking human sacrifices. Every year, the kingdom of Crete would be forced to send young people to be sacrificed to the beast, ensuring that the Minotaur was fed and its fury kept in check. The labyrinth, though a prison, offered no peace. It merely prolonged the suffering. Minos believed that with the Minotaur imprisoned, the kingdom would be safe, but he could not foresee what was about to happen. The pressure of the sacrifices and the terror that would spread to Athens, where the Minotaur would now become a legend, were about to turn Crete into a place of eternal nightmare. Crete, after the birth of the Minotaur, plunged into an era of tensions and turmoil. Minos, though he had managed to imprison the creature, was not at peace. The fear that the beast might escape one day haunted him, but what truly shook him was the tragedy that befell his family. His son, Androgeus, a young and promising prince, was the jewel of Crete. Intelligent, strong, and skilled, he was destined to become a great leader. His courage and combat abilities were known throughout the kingdom. However, fate led him to Athens, where his name would be marked by a tragic end. Androgeus had traveled to Athens to compete in a series of athletic games, where the city-states challenged each other in a demonstration of strength and courage. But to his surprise, things didn't go as expected. During the games, the prince was assassinated by political enemies who saw him as a threat to their own rise to power. The young warrior from Crete, in his journey of honor, met a violent and senseless death, an irreplaceable loss for his father, Minos. When the news reached Crete, it was like a sharp blade cutting through Minos's heart. The pain he felt upon hearing of his son's death was not just the loss of an heir, but a direct blow to his honor and status as king. Prince Androgeus was more than a son. He was the symbol of Crete's greatness. Now, with him dead, Minos felt his authority threatened as never before. Enraged by the death of his son, Minos did not hesitate to declare war on Athens. He swore revenge, not only for Androgeus' death, but for the humiliation his family had suffered. His anger and thirst for justice were immense, and he gathered a powerful army with loyal soldiers and experienced commanders ready to take the fight to Athens. The conflict that followed was brutal and relentless. Minos, with the weight of the pain from an irreparable loss, waged an immense war against Athens, seeking to crush the city he saw as responsible for his son's death. The Cretan army advanced mercilessly, invading Athenian territory and leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Athens, though more strategic, was unprepared for Minos's overwhelming force, who was determined to make the city pay for his pain. The war was long, and as the armies clashed, the people of Athens lived in terror, fearing the retribution of the king of Crete. But deep down, one question remained. Would Minos's vengeance truly bring peace back to his kingdom? Or would his quest for justice lead him down a never-ending path marked by more death and destruction? Meanwhile, in the heart of Athens, the memory of Androgeus became a symbol of the conflict, and his death a catalyst for the events that were to come. Minos would not settle for just the war. He wanted a definitive punishment. And what followed, no one could predict, not even the gods themselves. The war between Crete and Athens stretched for months, bringing devastation and suffering. The two powers, shaken by anger and the desire for vengeance, fought relentlessly. Minos, with his immense rage over the loss of Androgeus, imposed harsh conditions on Athens, seeking a way to punish the city for what had happened to his son. After a series of bloody battles, Minos, determined to force Athens to submit, demanded something unthinkable, a blood tribute. He ordered that every cycle of years, Athens would have to send 7 young men and 7 maidens to his land to be sacrificed to the Minotaur. He believed that in doing so, not only would he avenge Androgeus' death, but also humiliate Athens, forcing it to submit to his command. The people of Athens, terrified, had no choice but to accept this horrific demand. The news of the tribute arrived in Athens like a mortal blow, and panic spread throughout the city. Parents who had lost children in the previous battles now faced an even more terrifying threat. Every cycle of years would bring a new batch of youths to be sent to Crete. Those chosen knew their fate would lead them to the dreaded Labyrinth, where they would be offered as food to the Minotaur. With no hope of return, with broken hearts, the citizens of Athens prepared for the sacrifice, knowing that Minos's fury would not be easily quelled. The city was consumed by grief, aware that every year they would have to send their children to face a horrible and senseless death. For many, the idea of fighting the Minotaur seemed like a suicide mission. But the tribute was a cruel reality that could not be avoided. King Aegeus, desperate to protect his people, sought a way to break the cycle of pain and humiliation imposed by Minos. But the gods, watching the events from distant and indifferent eyes, did nothing to intervene. The tribute would continue to be part of Athens' nightmare, and the shadow of the Minotaur loomed over the city's youth like an endless curse. Then, among the young men and women to be sent, one name stood out. A young man with fierce determination, someone who, without hesitation, volunteered for the most dangerous mission of all. He could no longer live with the weight of helplessness and pain. Theseus, son of Aegeus, decided it was time to end the suffering of his city, even if it meant facing the most terrible of creatures. Theseus knew this was his chance to honor his father's memory and free Athens from this infernal tribute. He volunteered to be one of the sacrifices, but with a promise in mind. If he survived, he would destroy the Minotaur and put an end to Minos's tyranny. With courage and hope in his heart, Theseus prepared for the journey that would change not only his destiny, but that of all Athens. The news that Theseus, the young prince, had volunteered for the blood tribute caused a stir in Athens. Everyone was terrified at the idea of sending more youth to face the Minotaur, but Theseus's gesture was seen by some as a ray of hope. What seemed like a suicide mission to many, Theseus saw as an opportunity to end the cycle of suffering haunting. His city, Aegeus, his father, could hardly believe his son's words. His father's heart broke, for he knew the chances of survival in the labyrinth were minimal. The Minotaur, with its immense strength and the fury of an unrelenting beast, was a threat that no one seemed capable of defeating, no matter how much. Aegeus tried to convince Theseus to give up. The decision was already made. Theseus was determined, more than ever, to change Athens' fate, and there were no words that could deter him from his mission. "I won't let more lives be lost in vain," Theseus said firmly, his eyes shining with courage. He knew his life was at risk, but his vision of a future free from Minos' tyranny pushed him forward. Aegeus, a mix of pride and pain, made one last plea. "My son, if you truly go, make me a promise. If you survive, change the sails of the ship. If you return victorious, raise the white sails, and I will know you have completed your mission. If not, the black sails will signal my greatest fear." Theseus, with a resolute look, accepted his father's request. The white sails would be proof that he triumphed, and Aegeus' grief in case of failure would be irreparable. But at that moment, the young hero could not think of the possibility of failure. His mind was focused only on winning, on ending the nightmare that had plagued Athens for so long. The ship that would take him to Crete set sail at dawn, and the biting wind of the sea seemed to reflect the storm of emotions inside Theseus. He knew what lay ahead: the labyrinth, the creature waiting for him, and the fight for survival. The journey was long, and during the trip, Theseus mentally prepared for what was to come. He knew it would not just be a physical battle against the Minotaur, but also a mental one, where each step in the labyrinth could be his last. When the ship finally docked in Crete, Theseus felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He was closer to his goal, but also closer to death. Upon disembarking, he was met with disdain and indifference from the Cretans, who saw the Athenians as nothing more than sacrificial pawns. Theseus, however, kept his stance firm, his spirit unshaken by the adversities. It was then that, before being taken to the labyrinth, he encountered an unexpected figure, Ariadne, the daughter of Minos. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something changed. She saw in Theseus not just the hero destined to die, but someone capable of changing the course of history. A silent connection formed between them, and Ariadne felt in some way that her destiny was tied to his. She knew that for him to win, she would need to offer her help. Ariadne, with a shy smile, handed Theseus a ball of thread. "This thread will help you find your way back," she said, her eyes shining with a mix of hope and fear. "Use it in the labyrinth, and never lose sight of the thread that will guide you. I can't go with you, but I will be cheering for your victory." Theseus looked at the thread with gratitude. The young princess was offering him the one thing that could guarantee his survival. "I won't fail," he said, feeling the weight of responsibility, not just for his life, but for all of Athens. With the ball of thread in hand and Ariadne's gaze etched in his mind, Theseus prepared to face the terror of the labyrinth and finally confront the Minotaur. With the thread firmly in hand, Theseus moved away from Ariadne and headed toward the labyrinth. Before entering the dark world of Daedalus, he looked toward the horizon, where the sea stretched as far as the eye could see. Deep in his heart, the promise he made to his father resonated. Aegeus, though fearful, had asked him one last thing, that if he survived, he would return with the white sails on the ship. Those sails became, for Theseus, the symbol of hope. He knew he could not fail, not just for the city of Athens, but for his father's love. If the black sails were kept, Aegeus would believe his son had not survived, and the pain of his loss would be even deeper. But Theseus felt confident, determined, to do the impossible to ensure that his mission would succeed. As the young hero walked away to enter the labyrinth, the emotion filling his chest was a mix of courage and a slight apprehension about what awaited him in the depths of that terrifying place. The labyrinth, designed to confuse, torture, and trap even the wisest of men, was a never-ending prison. But he wasn't there to get lost. The heat of the day gave way to the coolness of the night as Theseus entered the labyrinth's bowels. The narrow corridors and cold walls seemed to breathe, and the sound of his own footsteps echoed, reminding him that he was completely alone, with only the ball of thread to guide him. He pulled the thread carefully, feeling the tension with each movement, as if the labyrinth had a life of its own and challenged him to keep going. With each step, the memory of Ariadne and her silent help drove him forward, but the weight of the mission was too great for him to afford hesitation. The Minotaur was waiting, ready to make Theseus yet another victim of its insatiable hunger. But the young prince had no intention of being just another piece in this cruel game. He was there to end the beast, to put an end to the monstrosity that had tormented his city. The labyrinth grew more twisted, and Theseus realized that time was against him. The ball of thread guided him with precision, but with each turn he made, the path seemed more difficult, denser. It was as if the darkness was trying to swallow his courage, but he knew that no matter how challenging it was, he had to move forward. With his heart racing and cold sweat running down his face, Theseus pressed on, thinking of his father and the promise he had made. He didn't want to be just a hero who survived. He wanted to be the hero who would bring freedom back to Athens. And that meant facing the Minotaur. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Theseus reached the center of the labyrinth. In the depths of that darkness, a shadow moved, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the walls of the space. The Minotaur was there, waiting, like a hungry beast that knew no mercy. With the ball of thread still firmly in his hand, Theseus prepared for the confrontation. He knew this would be the greatest challenge of his life, a challenge he couldn't afford to lose. He was ready to fight, not just for his survival, but for the future of Athens and the promise he had made to his father. The sound of heavy footsteps and the smell of sweat and blood grew stronger as Theseus moved toward the heart of the labyrinth. There in the shadows the Minotaur rose, its massive figure standing out, a fusion of man and beast. Its eyes glowed with a wild fire, and its roar made the walls tremble. The battle was inevitable, but before Theseus could take the first step, an unexpected light appeared at the end of the corridor. He felt a spark of hope, something pushing him to keep going, even in the face of the terrifying creature before him. That's when he saw Ariadne. She was there, her eyes fixed on him, a gesture of silent help. With a soft smile, she raised her hand and guided him to a small opening hidden in the labyrinth wall. At first, Theseus didn't understand, but as he looked closer, he saw that she was holding something in her hand, a ball of thread. Ariadne had, without hesitation, returned to help him, offering him the key to his survival. "Take this," she said firmly, extending the thread. "With it, you'll never get lost. The thread will lead you out, but it will also be your light in the darkness." Theseus couldn't hide the relief he felt as he took the thread. His heart beat faster, not only at the thought of an exit, but because of Ariadne's gesture, which showed her trust in him and his mission. He knew that without her, the labyrinth would have been an endless prison. "I promise, Ariadne, I will leave here with you. I will keep my promise to my father, and I will bring justice to Athens. I thank you more than words can say," he responded. With a determined look, the young princess looked at him with affection, but also with a silent concern. She knew the battle with the Minotaur wouldn't be easy, but she was confident in Theseus's strength. She wanted more than anything for him to win, not just for his city, but for herself, as she had fallen in love with him the moment she saw him. With the thread now in his hands, Theseus took the first step toward the monstrous creature awaiting him. He felt the thread slip through his fingers as he moved toward the final confrontation. With each step, the labyrinth seemed to close in around him, but Ariadne's presence and the thread kept him steady. She watched from a distance, her heart tight, knowing he was about to face the greatest test of his life. But at the same time, she believed in his potential. Theseus was more than just a hero. He was the hope of a people, the future of a city on the brink of destruction. The battle was about to begin, and with the ball of thread in his hands, Theseus felt like nothing could stop him. The Minotaur, as immense and fearsome as it was, didn't know what awaited it. The sound of the Minotaur's heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, a constant beat that made Theseus's heart race with each passing second. He was now face with the beast, and what had once seemed like a distant fairy tale, a story told by candlelight, was now his cruel reality. The Minotaur loomed before him, its glowing eyes and sharp teeth ready to destroy everything in its path. The labyrinth seemed designed to swallow all light, but with the ball of thread firm in his hands, Theseus didn't feel lost. He had the guidance, he had the thread, and most importantly, he had his courage. The ferocity of the beast was nothing compared to his destiny, his mission. Theseus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his sword at his belt. But it wasn't only this that armed him. He carried the future of Athens, the promise to his father, and above all, the will to end the suffering that this creature had brought upon his people. The Minotaur charged, its claws digging into the ground as it roared with all the fury of its rage. Theseus stepped back but didn't falter. He knew he had to be fast, smart, or the Minotaur would crush him with its immense strength. Using the thread, Theseus advanced with skill, following the path of the thread, always alert to the beast's movements. Suddenly, the Minotaur leapt furiously, trying to reach Theseus with a devastating blow. But Theseus was ready. He dodged. With agility, rolling to the side, and with the strength of his sword, struck the beast with a precise blow. The Minotaur roared in pain, but its fury was immense, and it turned to attack again. Theseus, without hesitation, took another step forward. He couldn't afford to stop. He couldn't afford to doubt. He had to win, not just for his life, but for all those who trusted him. The labyrinth now seemed like a silent stage, where the only sound was the Minotaur's fierce roar and the echo of Theseus' quick steps, never losing the thread. It was as if the labyrinth itself was cooperating, guiding him toward victory. With one last decisive move, Theseus leapt to the side, making the Minotaur charge toward him, and with a cry of strength and courage, he drove his sword into the heart of the beast. The Minotaur fell, its fury transformed into eternal silence. Theseus, panting, looked at the creature's body on the ground, feeling the weight of what he had just accomplished. The Minotaur, symbol of all the terror that had dominated Athens for so long, was dead. He had won. But in that moment, amidst the stillness that followed, Theseus felt the pressure of his mission intensify. He was no longer just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting to restore hope to his people. The labyrinth was no longer a prison. It was the key to a new future. With the Minotaur finally defeated, Theseus looked at the ball of thread he still held, now lighter in his hands, and with a smile of relief, he took the first step toward the exit. After the decisive battle, Theseus's heart was filled with a mixture of relief and euphoria. He had fulfilled his mission, defeated the Minotaur, and in doing so, secured the freedom of the youth of Athens, who would be spared from the terrible tribute imposed by Minos. The victory was bittersweet but essential. The hero now saw himself not only as a son of Athens, but as someone who would change the fate of his city. But when he returned to the labyrinth, the light in his eyes faded as he looked at Ariadne, who was waiting for him with an expression caught between hope and anxiety. She was there at the entrance of the labyrinth, ready to flee with him, just as they had promised. The young princess had trusted him, believed in him, and her presence brought Theseus more than just gratitude. It brought a desire to embark on the journey with her, away from Crete in search of a new beginning. Without saying a word, Theseus took her hand and led her along the path back, the ball of thread already discarded, now unnecessary. They were out of the labyrinth, and soon they would take the ship that would carry them to Athens. Liberation seemed near, and they both dreamed of a future together, where they could finally live without fear of a cruel king and without the burden of ancient curses. But fate, as always, had other plans. As the boat sailed across the calm waters of the Aegean Sea, something began to change. Theseus, his eyes on the horizon, felt a strange chill in the air. Ariadne was by his side, but her gaze, once full of hope, now became distant, as if she were battling her own thoughts. She knew what was about to happen, but hesitated to reveal the truth. And no matter how much Theseus wanted to ignore what was going on, an invisible force was about to separate them. That was when Dionysus, the god of wine and joy, appeared. On the scene, his presence arrived like an unexpected storm, a divine force that shattered the mortals' plans. He appeared in his glory, radiating light and power, and with an arrogant smile addressed Theseus. "Ariadne was given to me by my right," said Dionysus, in a tone of authority that allowed no argument. "She does not belong to you, mortal. I am the god of pleasure and freedom, and she will be my wife, as it is destined." Theseus, confused and stunned by the divine command, tried to protest, but he knew he could not defy a god. Ariadne's gaze, so full of love and faith until then, was now sad and resigned. She knew her fate had been sealed long before meeting him, and her life was about to change forever. She stood up from the bench where she'd been sitting and, with one last glance at Theseus, walked away. "I'm sorry, Theseus. I have no choice. This is bigger than us." The young hero felt the weight of betrayal, not from Ariadne, but from a merciless god who had simply decided she would be his. He looked at the young woman, but couldn't find words that could change the course of events. The love they shared had been torn apart by the whim of the gods, and with no other option, Ariadne walked away, following Dionysus in his golden chariot. As the wind hit Theseus's face, the sound of the sail flapping and the horizon ahead, he felt a mix of anger and helplessness. The love he thought was his had been taken by forces beyond his understanding. But he also knew he had a greater mission. Athens was calling him. He could not allow himself to be lost in the pain of a broken heart. So Theseus moved forward, but with an even heavier weight on his chest. He had faced monsters and labyrinths, but the pain of losing Ariadne, with no way to change her fate, was a burden he could never have imagined carrying. The wind blowing during the journey back to Athens seemed not only to divert Theseus's ship, but also to take away something he could never regain: hope. The echo of Ariadne's departure resonated in his thoughts, and no matter how much he tried to focus on the promise he had made to his father Aegeus, his mind was torn between duty and loss. The ship's sails were there, about to be changed, but the weight of sadness and anger prevented him from acting with clarity. It was a simple task, a small change, but crucial. Theseus had promised Aegeus that if he won and returned alive, he would change the ship's sails, white sails to signal victory, black sails if tragedy struck. The promise was rooted in his heart, but he couldn't help but be distracted by bitter thoughts. Ariadne was already distant, being led by the god Dionysus, and he felt lost in a sea of confusion and desolation. Upon arriving in Athens, Theseus didn't even notice that the ship's sails were still black. The wind, now stronger, hissed in his ears as if it were the whisper of a fatal warning. He only saw the city in the distance, the welcoming harbor, with its boats gently swaying on the calm waters, but the peace was illusory. Inside Theseus, the weight of failure pressed like a giant rock, squeezing his chest and spirit. When the ship finally docked, the first to run toward the quay was King Aegeus, his eyes shining with hope. He had waited for so many years, hoping his son would return victorious, that the lineage of Athens would finally endure. His heart raced with anticipation, and he approached with a radiant smile on his face. However, as soon as his eyes fixed on the black sails, a shiver ran down his spine. It was the signal, the worst of signals. The ship had returned, but not with good news. "It can't be," Aegeus murmured, his eyes filling with tears. "My son, Theseus, what happened?" Theseus stood frozen, speechless. His mind was still focused on his own suffering, and he didn't realize how much fear was reflected in his father's gaze. He had failed to fulfill the simplest, most important promise. With no more strength left, Aegeus looked at the sea, as if searching for answers in the vastness of the waters. The tragedy of his life unfolded before him. He knew his son's fate had now been sealed. His heart, already fragile from anticipation and accumulated anguish, could not bear the weight of this pain. The king could not bear the thought of losing his only son, the heir to Athens. With a cry of despair, he threw himself over the quay's parapet, letting himself fall into the deep waters of the Aegean Sea. The sound of his body submerging was the last echo of his pain. And so the sea, which had always represented the crossing and adventure for Theseus, now took on an even more painful meaning. He felt as if he were lost, not only in the vastness of the ocean, but in the enormity of his own failure. The city of Athens, which he had defended with such dedication, now bore the mark of an irreparable pain. Theseus, looking at the sea, understood the price he was paying for his victory. He had defeated the Minotaur, but in the process, he had lost something he could never recover: his father, Aegeus. The king had departed, taken by the wave of his own pain, and the city would now be ruled by his son, a hero who had defeated monsters but could not prevent fate from striking him once more. Theseus was now the king, but the weight of his loss would follow him for the rest of his life. The tragedy that shook Athens also resonated in Crete. Minos, the king of Crete, did not forget what had happened. The grief over the death of his son Androgeus and the contempt for Theseus, who not only defeated the Minotaur, but also abandoned his daughter Ariadne, had fueled a growing rage in his heart. Minos would not forgive easily. For him, vengeance was more than an impulse. It was a necessity to restore his honor and the balance of his power. Thus, he decided that Theseus must pay. And for that, the cruelest punishment would be the fate of the one who had been responsible for the hero's escape and his victory over the creature of Crete. It wasn't only Theseus that Minos wanted to destroy. It was also the one who, with his ingenuity, had helped the young man escape. The architect Daedalus, the man who had built the labyrinth, who had given Ariadne the ball of thread to guide Theseus, was the target of the king's fury. Minos, with his unrelenting gaze, ordered that Daedalus be captured. The old and wise engineer, who had become an essential part of the court of Crete, knew that despite his importance, his fate was now in the hands of a king thirsty for vengeance. When the guards reached him, there was no resistance. Daedalus knew that Minos's anger was something he could not fight against. He surrendered, resigned, accepting what was to come. Daedalus's fate was sealed, but it would not be a quick death. Minos, as cruel as ever, decided that the engineer and his son Icarus would be imprisoned inside the very labyrinth he had created to keep the Minotaur confined. Now, he would make Daedalus and Icarus lose themselves in their own creation, until death took them. Daedalus, however, was more than an ordinary man. He knew that if he wanted to survive, he would have to use his creative mind and engineering skills to find a way to escape. It was what he did best: build, think, invent. And it was this creativity that, instead of being his doom, became his only chance for survival. Inside the labyrinth, Daedalus reflected on the situation. The darkness around them was oppressive, and he knew that the only way out would be through the sky. While the labyrinth was vast and intricate, he was aware that the real danger didn't just come from the physical prison, but from his mind. Being consumed by hopelessness, then the idea struck him like a lightning bolt cutting through the darkness. He would start creating wings, not wings made of wood or cloth, but something far bolder, wings made of wax and feathers like a bird. Daring to challenge the heavens. Freedom was within reach, but it would be a risky flight. Daedalus and his son Icarus, united by the need to escape, and Daedalus's inventive mind, began working in secret, building their makeshift wings. The process was meticulous, each feather carefully adjusted, every layer of wax molded to ensure that at least they could get out of the labyrinth and reach the open sky. It was a risk, but for Daedalus the only option was escape or certain death. As time passed, the tension mounted. Minos was still secure in his palace, believing his enemies were irreparably lost. But Daedalus and Icarus were about to turn the tables. When they finally finished their wings, father and son prepared for the escape. Daedalus knew the flight wouldn't be easy, nor safe. The danger of flying too low was the moisture from the sea, which could cause the wings to disintegrate. But the greatest danger, by far, was flying too high. Icarus, impulsive and young, was too excited, his eyes shining with anticipation, wanting to reach the heights like a god. Daedalus, concerned, warned him, "Don't fly too high, Icarus. If the sun melts the wax, we'll be lost." But Daedalus's words seemed distant to the young man. With his heart full of courage and freedom on his mind, Icarus flew into the sky, not realizing how his recklessness was pulling him farther from his father, and that's what led to the tragedy. While Daedalus flew cautiously, watching the movement of the sea, Icarus, overwhelmed by euphoria, climbed higher and higher. The heat of the sun caused the wax to start melting. Icarus's wings lost their shape, and with a desperate cry, he fell, plunging into the sea below, which once again became the cause of a fatal destiny. Daedalus, desperate as he watched his son disappear over the horizon, tried to regain hope, but it was in vain. He knew his fate had changed forever. He had lost not only his freedom, but also the love of his son. Minos had won, not with strength, but with the cruelty of fate. Daedalus, now marked by this eternal pain, continued his journey, but the weight of the tragedy and the guilt of not being able to save Icarus followed him forever. The Labyrinth of Crete, which he had created to imprison the Minotaur, was now a reflection of his own suffering, a prison from which he could never escape. With the death of Aegeus, Athens was faced with an uncertain future. The king had fallen tragically, and the kingdom was filled with mourning and despair. However, for Theseus, the loss of his father was just the beginning of a new phase. After Aegeus's death, the young hero, who now understood the magnitude of his actions and the weight of his lineage, ascended to the throne with a determination that was hard to ignore. He'd faced unimaginable challenges and defeated one of the greatest monsters of Greek mythology, but ruling Athens would be his greatest test. Upon assuming the throne, Theseus was no longer just the hero who had defeated the Minotaur. He was the son of a king, a man now responsible for guiding a city that, until then, had never known peace after years of war and suffering. But Theseus was not just a warrior, he was also a visionary leader. What Athens needed most was stability and prosperity, and Theseus was determined to provide that. He initiated a series of political and social reforms that would forever change the fate of his city. He unified the tribes of Attica, creating a stronger and more cohesive city-state, and with his vision, he began to shape Athens into a place of justice, art, and culture. The streets of the city, once marked by chaos and war, now began to bloom with new ideas, new projects, and above all, a sense of security that had never existed before. Theseus, aware of his importance for Athens' future, never forgot the lessons life had taught him. The pain of losing his father, the tragedy that followed his victory over the Minotaur, and the realization that things don't always go as expected were hard but valuable lessons. He used them to rule wisely, always seeking justice and the protection of his people. The hero, now king, also sought to strengthen the culture and education of his city. Athens would become a center of wisdom and art. With Theseus as their leader, the city began to flourish. Philosophies and sciences that would later shape classical Greece were seeded, and the Athenians began to take pride in their intellectual and artistic heritage. The young king understood that the true power of a kingdom didn't come just from weapons, but from knowledge and the unity of its people. And so Theseus came to be remembered not only as a legendary hero, but as the great founder of a new Athens, stronger, more prosperous, and more just. Although the myth of his battle against the Minotaur would be told for generations, the stories of the wise king who unified Greece and brought a new beginning to Athens became what the Greeks celebrated most over the centuries. Through his leadership, Theseus not only solidified Athens' power, but also created a legacy that would endure for a long time, becoming a symbol of courage, wisdom, and justice for all those seeking a more harmonious world. And although the Minotaur and its threats were now part of the past, Theseus's true fight had just begun. The fight for a future where fear and division would be overcome by unity and wisdom. And so ends the incredible journey of Theseus, the hero who not only defeated the Minotaur but also built a new destiny for Athens. But what about you? What do you think of this fascinating story? Leave your comment below. Share your ideas and thoughts on Theseus's legacy and the impact of his actions. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed this epic narrative, and of course subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more stories like this. Hit the bell to stay updated on all the content we're preparing. Until next time.